All right, so today I would like to talk about a subject that's maybe not as important to everyone, but I think it should be because the King James Version still does hold a lot of sway in our world today. And this is certainly a version that I grew up with. And you may be asking, well, why are we talking about the King James Version? Well, first of all, when I typed into Google the word Bible, you know what my first result was? My first result was a advertisement for the King James Version. I mean, it's the year 2020. The King James Version came out in 1611, and yet to think that it's still in position 1 on Google when I searched for it. Another search result on Google was the website Bible.com, which is linked to the U version, and the default for those and that most popular app on people's phones is the King James Version. It's always in the list of best-selling Bibles, and it is regularly in the top 3. And in fact, I know several people that use the King James Version because not because they're wackos or weird, but because they believe the King James Version is the most accurate version. And so they're slogging through the Old English and doing all the hard work because they believe the payoff is worth it. And for some, it may have something to do with the philosophy of life, which I agree is generally true, that harder is usually better. But the King James Version is not as good as a number of other translations. And a lot of different churches and ministries and denominations have moved away from the King James Version, and they don't always really make it clear why, the reasons behind the shift away from the King James Version. So I grew up with the King James, loved it, didn't really think there was any problem with it. And later on, when I discovered that these easier to read versions were also more accurate, I was just blown away. And so I want to share with you some of the reasons why it is no longer, I would say, a good idea to use the King James Version, why I personally don't use it, really for anything, not for study, not for reference, and certainly not as a measuring stick by which to rate other versions of the Bible, which I think for a lot of people becomes kind of like a standard. They're like, well, the King James says this, and the NASB or the ESV or the NIV or whatever says that, and they're using the King James as if it's some sort of measuring stick. I don't think that's really a helpful use of the King James Version either. So let's get into it, shall we? Here's our outline for today. I want to look at very briefly some background of the King James Version, and then get into 4 main reasons why I no longer use it, which is it has late manuscripts, it has translation errors, it has a limited lexicography, that means an understanding of the original biblical languages, and fourthly, it has archaic vocabulary. So let's see a little background about the King James Version here. All right, so in the beginning of the King James, in the preface, it reads, "Truly, good Christian reader," and this is Old English spelling, so these are not typos, they're just Old English. "We never thought from the beginning that we should need to make a new translation, nor yet to make of a bad one a good one. For the imputation of Sixtus had been true in some sort, that our people had been fed with gall of dragons instead of wine, with whey instead of milk, but to make a good one better, or out of many good ones, one principal good one, not justly to be accepted against, that hath been our endeavor, that our mark." So the goal, according to the translators of the King James Version, is to make a good one better, or out of many good ones, one principal good one. So the King James is a revision. It is not a solo translation. It's not going directly from the languages and bringing it into English. It's actually revising what had previously been there. And so here's a little history, just ever so briefly. Really, the genius behind English translations, at least for starting this trend that culminates with the King James, is William Tyndale. I mean, there were a couple of others before him, but he's really the starting point for our focus here. And after him, Coverdale came out with a Bible, which was mostly just Tyndale and some extra parts added in because Tyndale was executed before he could finish translating the Bible fully. Then you had the Matthew Bible in 1537, the Great Bible in 1539. And then on the continent in Switzerland, you had the Geneva Bible in 1560, the Bishop's Bible revised the Great Bible, and then the Douay-Rheims Bible was a Catholic translation. So you really have these three different streams. You have like the mainstream from Tyndale forward to the Bishop's Bible, and then you have somewhat independent streams of the Geneva Bible and the Douay-Rheims Bible, which the King James then pulled upon all three of these streams of English Bible translations and did a thorough work in obviously comparing it with the original languages. But ultimately, the King James is a revision of the Bishop's Bible and the previous Bibles going back to Tyndale here. So the 1769 version is what most of us think of as the King James today. And that's because the original in 1611, when it came out, used a very different spelling system. I think I showed you some of the spelling of the original. So that was updated in 1769, but they didn't change the name. It's not called the KJVU, the King James Version updated. It's just still called the King James Version. And other translations have done that. The NIV does that. The ESV does that. They just update and they keep the same name. So that happened in 1769. And really, this version here, that's what most of us think of when we are referring to the King James Version. All right, then we had a revision of the King James Version, 1769, called the Revised Version in 1881. And then a century later, some other group revised the King James Version, calling it the New King James Version in 1982. Then the Revised Version was revised in America, called the American Standard Version of 1901. And then that was revised again, and this time they call it the Revised Standard Version of 1952, as well as the New American Standard Bible of 1971. A lot of people don't realize that the NASB, the original, was not a new translation. It was a revision of the American Standard Version. Then the Revised Standard Version was revised, so they put a new out front, call it the New Revised Standard Version in 1989. J.I. Packer and some others didn't like the NRSV, especially the gender inclusive language, so they came out with the ESV. They re-revised the Revised Standard Version. This is like who's on first. And then certainly the New American Standard Bible was updated in 1995. So why did we need a new translation of the Bible? Well, the answer is simply because King James didn't like the Geneva Bible. And here are some notes from the Geneva Bible that in particular he did not like. Exodus 1:19 in the Geneva Bible, which had all these marginal notes, said, when the Egyptian midwives disobey Pharaoh's order, it says, their disobedience herein was lawful. So I don't know about you, but if you're the king, right, you don't want people going around with a Bible that says, good on the midwives in Egypt for disobeying the king, right? Because then what would happen? People could say, oh, well, we can disobey the king when we want to because, look, the Bible endorses disobeying the king when you're going with your conscience. So King James did not like that about the Geneva Bible. Furthermore, in 2 Kings 9:33, it says, when Jehu has Queen Jezebel thrown out the window, it calls it a spectacle and an example of God's judgments to all tyrants. Uh-oh. You don't want throwing the queen out the window to be an example, do you? Not if you're the king. And then last of all, 2 Chronicles 15:16, when Asa deposed his mother for idolatry, it says, herein he showed that he lacked zeal, for she ought to have died. So the Geneva is saying, man, you really should kill off these royal people when they worship other gods and so on. So for all these different reasons, King James called the Geneva Bible, which was the main, most popular Bible at the time, let's see, very partial, untrue, seditious. This is pretty juicy, right? Very partial, untrue, seditious, and savoring too much of dangerous and traitorous conceits. Whew. Sorry, I didn't do that with a English accent. I'm limited in that respect there. But that's what he said about the Geneva Bible. And so what did King James do? Well, he authorized a new version of the Bible to be done as a competitor over against the Geneva Bible, which he considered to be an unauthorized version. Unauthorized for what? For use in his country? and for use in his churches. The king at this time in England is the supreme head of all the churches. So if you have an unauthorized version, it's not going to be allowed to be read in the churches of England. So he authorized this new version, and he got all these scholars together. There were about 54 scholars who worked on it. And to be honest, I think they did a great job. I think they were really, really well researched, well-intentioned people that did the best they could. Philip Comfort, who doesn't really even like the King James, says the following about it. The translation went through several committees before it was finalized. The scholars were instructed to follow the bishop's Bible as their basic version, as long as it adhered to the original text, and to consult the translations of Tyndale, Matthew, and Coverdale, as well as the Great Bible and the Geneva Bible when they appeared to contain more accurate renderings of original languages. Here he goes on to say, indeed, the King James Version has become an enduring monument of English prose because of its gracious style, majestic language, and poetic rhythms. No other book has had such a tremendous influence on English literature, and no other translation has touched so many lives of English-speaking people for centuries and centuries, even until the present day. So the King James Version, in my estimation, was really an excellent version and for its time, but it did have problems. And so I'd like to take a look at some of those problems with you right now. First off, I want to talk to you about late manuscripts. Okay, so this is really our focus for the first part of our critique here is the late manuscripts. Now, here's a list of Hebrew Masoretic texts. Masoretic text is sort of like the mainstream manuscript tradition that survives to our day. And what we can see here in the rightmost column is a little label that says available. That means available to scholarship, available to Europeans typically. And you can see that the Codex Cairensis, the Cairo Codex, which had a complete copy of the prophets from the year 896, wasn't made available until the year 1983. The Petersburg Codex, 1839, the London Codex, 1891, the Aleppo Codex, which is considered to be the most accurate Masoretic text on the planet, 1958 is when it became available to scholarship. The University of Michigan Torah, 1922, the Damascus Pentateuch, 1975, the Leningrad Codex, upon which almost all Old Testaments are based today, because it's a complete Old Testament, is 1863 when that became available. The University of Bologna Torah scroll wasn't available until 2013. So what did the King James people have available? Well, they had this printed Bible called the Mikraot Gedolot. Say that 10 times fast, right? And so this was a printed rabbinic Bible that they basically used. And it's just not as old, as you can see. All of these right here are 5 or more centuries older than what the King James was based on. But it's not like they did this badly. It just wasn't available. Look at how much has happened in the 19th and 20th centuries for discovery of Hebrew manuscripts. Furthermore, earlier non-Masoretic sources or partial Masoretic sources were also discovered, such as this little scroll, this little silver scroll, Ketephanom silver scroll, which dates all the way back to the 6th century before Christ. It's just got the benediction from number 6. That didn't become available till 1979. The Dead Sea Scrolls, the greatest discovery of the 20th century when it comes to the Old Testament, was not discovered until 1947 and not published until the 1990s. Then you had the Nash Papyrus in 1902, the Engedi Scroll, which wasn't even readable till 2016, and then the Cairo Geniza fragments, which includes tens of thousands of fragments of, and some larger portions of the Old Testament, wasn't available till the 19th century. And to be honest, they're still working their way through that in Oxford to this day. When we get to the New Testament, we have different sources. We have the papyri, the uncials, the minuscules, and the lectionaries, and that's roughly in chronological order. There is overlap, but the papyri are the earliest manuscripts, are all on papyrus paper, which is made from a reed by the Nile in Egypt. And so the papyri we have about 130 plus of those today, and they are some of them date all the way back to the 2nd century and 3rd centuries. And then you have the uncials. These are the most famous codices or books of manuscripts. And some of these, the earliest date to the year 350 or so, give or take. Then you have the minuscules. Minuscules don't start until the 9th century, because that's when the handwriting style of smaller letters, the minuscule script, became, I guess, invented and then popularized. And the lectionaries are more or less in the same time period as the minuscules, although you might see some that predate that. But what did the King James have available? They had no papyri, no uncials, except for they had only 2 uncials. One of them was called Codex D, Codex Beza or Beza, and the other one was Codex Regius. And neither of these are very good New Testament manuscripts. However, today, what do we have available to us? 4 centuries later, we have 140 papyri as opposed to 0. Instead of 2 uncials, we have 323. These are the catalog numbers. It's not exact because some of these get lost and some of them are joined together. Then we have 2,966 cataloged minuscules, 2,486 cataloged lectionaries, for a grand total of 5,915 Greek manuscripts. And like I said, that number is maybe as low as 5,800 once you take into factor historical stuff that's happened. So let's look at some of our other flaws here that really shine through as far as late manuscripts. This verse here in Revelation 22:19 in the King James Version reads, "And if any man shall take away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God shall take away his part of the book of life." Whereas the RSV and all modern versions read, "And if anyone takes away from the words of the book of this prophecy, God will take away his share in the tree of life." That's interesting. So and this is not a translation issue, this is a manuscript issue. The manuscripts that the King James Version had available that they translated from said book of life instead of tree of life. Now, why was that? Well, this actually goes way back to Desiderius Erasmus in the was it 1516? He started putting out his New Testament, and before long he was able to come out with the second version and then a third version. But Erasmus never had a manuscript for the last page of Revelation. So what he did was he just took the existing Latin that he thought the church, everyone thought was more or less accurate, I guess, and he back translated that into Greek. And the Latin had said book of life, but actually once they started discovering Revelation manuscripts for that last page, they realized that it said tree of life. So this is like a quick way to see, is a translation based on defective manuscripts or on more accurate manuscripts? You look at Revelation 22:19, and this is all the more ironic because the verse actually says, the whole point of the verse is like, don't change the Bible. Don't change, specifically, don't change the book of Revelation. And so that's the verse that Erasmus changed. But it certainly is a nice quick litmus test to look at. Let's look at another couple quick examples of manuscript deficiencies that shine through in the King James, along with other early versions. Let's see here. 1 Timothy 3:16. Some of you are probably aware of this. In the King James Version, it says that God was manifest in the flesh, whereas in the American Standard Version, it says he who was manifest in the flesh. I mean, does that seem like a big difference to you? It seems like a big difference to me. God or he. And here's the reason why. You have these two, what they call is nomina sacra. These are names that get abbreviated by the scribes when they copy. And so instead of writing out the word theos like this, what they do is they just write the first and the last letters, and then they just put a bar over the top of it to indicate that this is an abbreviation. And so in the earlier manuscripts, it said os, or if you're pronouncing it like an Erasmian, has, then you're going to maybe confuse these two together. I don't know. They don't look that similar. But what you do is if you put a line in the middle and then a line above it, let me get rid of my other annotations here. Yeah, now they look the same, right? So it could be a scribal error that turned who into God. It's very unlikely that you would turn God into who, right? It's more likely you would add than you would subtract. And we don't have to guess about it because the manuscripts tell us the story. This is a picture of Codex Sinaiticus, the oldest complete New Testament on the planet from about the year 350, discovered by Constantine von Tischendorf in the 1800s. And we can see that right above where it says os here, it actually says theos by a corrector. This corrector is from the 12th century. You can see here, there's your OC, which in Greek is the word, is a relative pronouns who or he who. And then right above it, you've got the theta sigma, the abbreviation for God. And so you can see exactly what is going on here. Another one of these kinds of examples comes to us from 1 John 5, 7 through 8, what we call the comma Johannium. And we can see on the left, the King James Version has this whole part about how there's three that bear record in heaven, the Father, the Word, and the Holy Ghost, and these three are one. On the right, it does not have that. And I spaced it so you can see exactly how much the King James has added in that's not in the oldest manuscripts. And so this whole section here is what we call the comma Johannium. And it is definitely not the earliest, not attested in the earliest manuscripts. For example, we find it in marginal notes. That means it's not even in the main manuscript. It's in the marginal note in these different minuscules, 221, 88, 429, 636. But the marginal notes don't date until the 15th or 16th century. Furthermore, if it's in the main text, these are the manuscripts that have the comma Johannium in the main text, 629, 661, 918, and 2318, all minuscules as well. The earliest of which is Codex Autobanianus, and that dates to the 14th or 15th century. It is pretty easy to know what went on there. It's a parallel Bible with Latin on one side and Greek on the other. The Latin had this Trinity formula in 1 John 5, 7, so the scribe inserted it, translated into Greek, and inserted it on the opposite page. Codex Montfortianus famously was the codex given to Erasmus, because what Erasmus had said to his opponents was, I'm not going to put these verses into the Bible unless you can show me one manuscript that contains them. And they said, all right, you want a manuscript that contains them? Let's make a manuscript. So they manufactured in Dublin, Ireland, this codex, and they gave it to Erasmus and said, all right, see, it's in there. You have to put it in. And that's in fact what happened. Erasmus did put it in as a result of this this manuscript, which was obviously just made for this purpose. In fact, it's interesting, if you read Codex Montfortianus, the telltale sign that it's manufactured is that the comma Johannium, and this is a little technical, but it doesn't have definite articles at all. And that is an indicator that you're going from Latin, because Latin doesn't have the definite article. It doesn't have the word the. How do you conquer the world for like a millennium without the word the? I don't know. The Romans did it. And whereas the Greek language loves the word the, they just love the definite article. It shows up in all kinds of places that we wouldn't use it in English. And it's missing, it's entirely missing from this one section, which indicates that it was something translated from Latin into Greek. So that's another indicator of that. Let's look at some extra verses in the King James Version. We've got an interesting list here. Matthew 17, 21, 18, 11, 23, 14. We've got verses from Mark, from Luke, from John, from Acts, from Romans. In all, we have 16 added verses that are in the King James Version that are not in other English translation. And this really can throw people off, because what happens is they'll be reading through their Bible. I'm talking about a modern Bible, not even the King James. You read through your Bible, say the ESV, for example, and suddenly you encounter a verse that doesn't exist. In other words, like, for example, in Matthew 17, you'll go from verse 20, and then the next verse is verse 22. Why is your Bible missing a verse? Well, it's not missing a verse. It's that these verses had accumulated over time in the manuscript tradition, so that in the medieval manuscripts on which the King James Version was based, when they decided where the verses would be, they had already figured out what the numbers were. And so the King James conformed to that standard. But then when we found the older manuscripts, this verse system was already in place. So they said, well, what do we do? They could either subtract out that verse, but then that would change the location of all subsequent verses in that chapter. And now you're memorize locations for verses would be wrong. I guess they thought that was too much trouble. So what they did is they just skip the number. And when you are reading along in your Bible, there's 16 places where this happens, and it skips a number. The reason why is simply because the older manuscripts contain an extra verse there that is not in the oldest manuscripts that we have. All right, let's move on to another problem here. Late manuscripts, translation errors. Who's ready for translation errors? This is not as much fun as talking to a room full of people. Just going to throw that out there right now. But yeah, translation errors are a second component of why I no longer use the King James Version. And I'll just show you a quick example of this. This is Ephesians chapter 3, verse 10, which I have for you here, the Greek, the King James, and the NASB. The King James reads, to the intent that now unto the principalities and powers in heavenly places might be known by the church the manifold wisdom of God. I realize you might not have caught all that at once, but let's put it this way. That's an inverted sentence. That's a totally backward sentence. The subject of the sentence is following the sentence, is at the end of it. Typically in English, unless you're trying to emphasize something, you put the subject of the sentence in the beginning part of the sentence, whereas the NASB took that manifold wisdom of God and put it out front. So you can see it here in the Greek. It says the manifold wisdom of God right there at the end of the sentence. The King James Version very carefully followed the exact ordering of the sentence in Greek, even though that makes weird English, as attested by the ultra-literal NASB. Even the NASB reordered the sentence so that the beginning of the sentence, or the subject of the sentence, would be at the beginning of the sentence. The manifold wisdom of God might now be made known through the church to the rulers and the authorities in heavenly places. And what this tells me is that the King James Version was what we call a formal equivalence version. It's bending over backwards to, as much as possible, mirror the language that it's translating. However, that style can produce sentences that are very difficult for English speakers that are not familiar with that. But let's get into some actual errors. I just wanted to show you the translation style first here. Okay, I guess I don't have a slide for the errors. I'm just gonna tell you what they are. All right, you ready? 1 Timothy 6:10 is a famous verse. Have you ever heard of the phrase, money is the root of all evil? Yeah, it's not in the Bible. It's in the King James, but it's not in the manuscripts from which the King James was translated, and it's not in our more updated manuscripts based on the older text. 1 Timothy 6:10 doesn't have the word the, it doesn't have the definite article. And let me tell you, there's a big difference between a root and the root when it comes to evil, right? So the King James reads like, all problems, all sin leads back to money. Whereas what the Greek actually says is that it's a root. That's 1 Timothy 6:10. Ephesians 2:1 is another example where the King James just did something weird. Ephesians 2:1 says, and you hath he quickened who were dead in trespasses and sins. It doesn't say hath he quickened in the Greek. And the King James knows that, which is kind of interesting because they italicize words that are added in that are not in the original languages. And so that's what they did. They italicized the words in Ephesians 2:1 where it says, you hath he quickened. And I don't know why they did that. Maybe they thought people were going to get super depressed with Ephesians 2, which is a super depressing beginning to a chapter. And they wanted to sort of telegraph the punch by saying, hey, it's going to be okay. You're going to get quickened in a few verses here. I don't know. I have no idea why they did it, but they added in a phrase that's totally missing in the Greek. Then another example is Matthew 23, verse 24, where the King James Version says, if you strain at a gnat, not strain out a gnat. If you strain at something, you think of somebody like squinting their eyes, trying to see it, right? You're not thinking of using a strainer and you're trying to get something out of it. No, you strain things out, not at. And that's just another little error in the King James Version. So I don't mean to give you the impression that King James was perfect. I think it was a great translation for what they had available, but as we saw, it does have some errors and some problems. All right, moving on then to one of the bigger issues, which is limited lexicography. Did you know that 9 times in the King James Version they use the word unicorn? Yeah, the mythical horse with the horn doesn't exist in real life. 9 times they took the word wild ox and they translated it unicorn. Yeah, they just got it wrong. No translations do that anymore. Or how about in Isaiah 14, verse 12, where they translate the phrase son of the morning. The phrase son of the morning in Isaiah 14:12, they translate that as Lucifer. And now, because they did that, which is just a mistranslation, it's son of the morning. It's talking about the king of Babylon. I don't even think Isaiah 14 is talking about the devil. But because the King James Version basically imported this sort of Latin term as a name in Isaiah 14:12, how many movies, books, TV shows, pop culture references, or whatever refer to the devil as having the name Lucifer as a result of this just error in understanding the original language, which is what lexicography is. They misunderstood the word for wild ox as unicorn. They misunderstood the phrase son of the morning for Lucifer. And Robert Alter, who's an expert on Bible translation, explains this nicely when he says, the 17th century translators, for all their learning, had a rather imperfect grasp of biblical Hebrew. At times they get confused about syntax, and they repeatedly miss the nuance or even the actual meaning of Hebrew words. Usually this is a matter of being slightly off or somewhat misleading, as when, following the Vulgate, they transpose concrete Hebrew terms into theologically fraught ones, soul for nephesh, which actually means essential self, being, life, breath, or salvation for Yeshua, which means rescue, getting out of a tight fix. Sometimes, alas, there are real howlers. Such errors are probably understandable because Hebrew was a book language for them, cultivated for barely a century by Christian humanists. Let me show you another example of where the King James Version people just misunderstood a Hebrew word. In 2 Samuel 6:19, the king throws a party. And it says in the King James, he dealt among all the people, even among the whole multitude of Israel, as well to the women as men, to every one of them a cake of bread and a good piece of flesh and a flagon of wine. Wow, sounds like a great party. Except the words flagon of wine is totally a mistranslation. It's a cake of raisins. So I don't know if like kings have subsequently thrown parties with a lot of wine as a result, trying to imitate this verse. But what this verse actually says is raisin cakes, which is not as exciting, we have to admit. But I'd rather get to what's accurate rather than what's exciting, wouldn't you? Another example of limited lexicography when it comes to the Greek side of the equation for the King James Version is how they use the word world for the Greek word age, aeon. Instead of translating it as age, they translate it as world. And so we get these this phrase in English that is really not all that biblical, and it's the phrase, the end of the world. How many movies and scenarios have you seen like that? Whereas actually in the Greek, it's the end of the age. You have this age, and then you have the age to come. It's not like you have this planet, and then there's going to be another planet to come later on. But when you hear that phrase, end of the world, you think of total destruction, comet hitting the earth, or whatever movie you have in mind there. But that's not at all what the actual Bible says. It says end of this age. All right, so let's move on to our last point, which is archaic vocabulary. Archaic vocabulary. And let me show you an example. Luke 17, verse 9 says in the 1611 version, doth he thank ye that Siruant, because he did the things that were commanded him, I trow not. All right, I was being ridiculous there, but I was saying it that way to emphasize how the spelling is so weird. Most of us have never even seen the 1611 King James. Let me read it from the updated 1769. Doth he thank that servant because he did the things that were commanded him? I trow not. Question. What does the word trow mean? is probably not a word that you use on a regular basis, I'm guessing. As it turns out, you could read the entire King James Version and you'll never encounter the word tro other than this verse right here. So even if you say, oh, Sean, I can figure out words based on context, not this one. This is the only incident of the word tro in the King James Version. So it makes it a little bit difficult. Furthermore, this language is not limited, this archaic language, it's not limited to just words that we don't happen to use anymore. It's actually much worse than that, because there are words that we use regularly that meant something different back then than they mean today. And this is even more problematic than just having to look up an occasional word in a dictionary or in your phone or whatever you use. Here's another couple of examples from the Bible. Philippians 3:21, who shall change our vile body that it may be fashioned into his glorious body. Vile body. That sounds super Gnostic to me. The idea that the human body is just vile, it's gross, it's disgusting, it's an abomination, and we just need to escape our bodies, right? That's the Gnostic idea. That's not what the word vile meant in 1611. Vile actually meant humble. And that's why modern translations translated, who shall change our humble body that it may be fashioned like unto his glorious body. Well, look, if you don't know that, if you just think vile means what it means today, then you're going to read this sentence incorrectly. Or how about this? Study to show thyself approved unto God, a workman that needeth not to be ashamed. The word study in Old English did not mean sit there with a book and a pen and do schoolwork. No, not at all. Study in Old English just meant be zealous for or be diligent. It has nothing to do necessarily with acquiring knowledge. I mean, it could, but it's about an attitude of invigoration towards the subject, right? In other words, be diligent to show yourself approved to God. That's really what this verse is saying. And there are a whole bunch more. This is a abbreviated list here, but just to show you how some of these work, the term mean man in 1611 meant just your average person, common man, or in our language today, we would say person instead of man, because it could be a woman as well, right? Whereas the modern meaning of a mean man is a cruel man, a bad guy. Meat used to mean any kind of food, but now it means flesh. Peculiar used to mean that which belongs to one person. Now it means something strange. That's totally different. Cherish used to mean to keep warm. So to cherish your wife, just to the husbands out there, just means keep her warm. So don't worry about that. No, I'm just kidding. You weren't married in 1611, were you? Yeah, no, it means today to care about somebody, not just to keep them warm. So maybe that's an upgrade on that word. Passenger used to mean a passerby, just somebody that happens to be going by. Now it means somebody that's riding in a vehicle. To prevent meant to come before, and now it means to hinder. This is interesting for 1 Thessalonians 4, where it says, those who alive and remain will not prevent those who have fallen asleep. And so you can get just wrong theology there because you don't understand that the word prevent means to come before, not to stop somebody from doing something in the old version. And then carriage is something carried, whereas today it's something in a horse-drawn vehicle. So yeah, let me offer some concluding remarks here, and then we can get into some Q&A. In conclusion, the King James Version is an excellent masterpiece of English literature that, considering the scholarship and manuscripts available at the time, they did more or less the best job they could in 1611. However, it does have some of these problems with it that are enough for me such that I no longer use the King James Version. And let me just ever so briefly remind you of what those are. One is that they have, in the King James Version, they had access to only late manuscripts. The discoveries, the incredible discoveries of the late 1800s and throughout the 20th century just didn't happen yet, so they only had the later manuscripts. Second of all, they have translation errors where they just get it wrong, or they add in extra words, or they mangle the sentence order because they're trying to follow the Greek so excessively close. And then we have limited lexicography where they get Hebrew words wrong or Greek words wrong. And then there's archaic vocabulary. And archaic vocabulary, a lot of us think, oh, Sean, I can handle Old English. I took Shakespeare in high school. I'll be fine. These and thous don't bother me. I'm not talking about these and thous. Those are not that big a deal. I'm talking about thinking you understand the word and the word has changed its meaning so that what you think it means is not what it means anymore. And only if you have really an expert knowledge of Old English are you even going to be able to spot those differences between what that word meant in that context and what that word commonly means to us today. And this is why, these 4 reasons, and probably others as well, this is why the King James Version has been updated. It got updated in 1769, it got updated in 1885, in 1901, in 1952, 1989, and so on and so forth, and it's still being updated. Every time they come out with a new ESV, and actually I heard they're working on a new NRSV and a new NASB. But these are both ultimately revisions of the King James Version going way back to even before the King James to the time of Tyndale. Now, here's where this really gets practical for a lot of us. Have you ever sat in a Bible study where somebody's using the King James Version and they raise the question, well, my version says this, and they've got like some extra words, or it's just a totally different sense to the verse. And you can end up spending a lot of time fussing with manuscript issues or translation issues with the King James Version that even if you had a whole bunch of different modern versions, you wouldn't have this problem. And so this really does, in a sense, undermine people's confidence in Scripture because they're like, oh, well, this was wrong or that was wrong. It's better just to not use the King James Version. It doesn't provide any advantages unless you're a specialist in Old English, and it does have beautiful Old English. I mean, there's no question about that. But it is of little use for us today in most of our Bible study and certainly in preaching as well. So those are the reasons why I no longer use the King James Version. I wrote this long article about translation in general, and you can get that on my website, restitutio.org, or you can get it where Carlos mentioned at theologicalconference.org. But this is actually presenting just one section of that paper. So if you're interested in more of it, you can take a look at that on my website or on the Theological Conference website.